joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream to discuss all things related to digital transformation. Uh, my name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that provides digital transformation consulting services to clients throughout the world. Today's topic that we're going to discuss is ERP systems, best of breed, and software platforms. Which is best for your organization? That's the topic we'll get into here today with our guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Before I introduce our guest, though, just a couple of logistical things. First of all, as I mentioned, this is a live stream we host every Tuesday at the same time, same place on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So be sure to check us out every Tuesday at this time. You can also find this discussion is going to be part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast episode that gets released next week. So you're getting to be part of the live production of the show here today. We use this recording, we edit it, we add more content to it, and then we put out a complete long form episode of Transformation Ground Control, which is the podcast I host each week. That episode with today's interview will be released a week from tomorrow on Wednesday of next week. So be sure to check that out. If you don't already subscribe to that podcast, be sure to check it out there. You can find that on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. It streams every Wednesday. You can also find it on audio podcast platforms throughout the world. And again, that name is called Transformation Ground Control. Secondly, I've got a list of questions I'm going to start with here today for our guests around this topic of how to choose between ERP systems, best of breed, or some sort of hybrid. But I'd love to hear your questions and comments as we go here today. So be sure to drop in the chat any questions you might have, and we'll be sure to get to those as we get started here today. And in fact, as we get started here today, if you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat where you're joining from, I'd love to hear what city and what country you're joining from today. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat wherever you're watching, what city and country you're joining from today. We'd love to see where our global digital transformation community is joining here today. And again, our topic is ERP systems, best of breed, and software platforms, which is best. And joining me for this conversation is Soma, who is the president and chief technology officer of Infor Software, which is one of the largest ERP software providers in the world. And I'll let him describe a little bit more about himself and about Infor. But Soma, thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Eric, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Soma Somasundaram. Just like Eric did, most people just call me Soma. There's only a few people with one name, right? Madonna or Sting, Prince. This
and
is Soma, so that's me. Not because I'm famous, but last name is a tongue twister. So I'm the president and CTO at Infor, like you just heard, and my hometown is Philly. Our headquarters is in New York, so a little bit of a commute, but I usually am in the office at least several weeks in a month. But today I happen to be in Philly, so nice to meet everyone.
Great. Well, thank you for being here, and it's nice to have a one-name celebrity on the show. And you kind of are. I think you're understating your influence in the industry. You are pretty well known in the space, and I've known you for several years. I know many in the industry have known you for a long time. But maybe talk a little bit about your background. Just how did you grow up in the world of ERP, and what is it you do at Infor? And maybe just tell us a little bit about your background to start.
Yeah, sure. If I start with my experience, it will date me really, but this is I've been in this industry for just over 40 years. When I graduated out of school, there was an MIT affiliate in India where I went to school and did actually systems engineering. There was no computer science at that time, but anyway, I started with a company called Wang Labs. They came up with these mini computers and it just so happened, just to compress the 40 years in 60 seconds, all of my experience happened to be in the enterprise application space. So I lived through that company, I lived in Bahrain for a couple of years and worked with Bahrain Slipway, and lived in UK, in London, then lived in Singapore, Australia, lived in Germany, in Düsseldorf and Frankfurt. So lived all over the place like a nomad. But it also gave me a lot of experience working in different cultures, different types of companies. and eventually the last part was Melbourne, Australia, where I wrote an ERP product I should say. I didn't write it solely by myself. Led a build out of an ERP system for food and beverage chemical companies, and that got bought by a company in Philly. So I moved here in 1995. That company became Infor, and so long history with Infor, and very, very long background with enterprise applications, ERP, supply chain, financials, in that space. So that's my quick background. I've always run R&D, but off late, so I have about 8,000 plus engineers, and I'm also responsible for support, customer success, our cloud operations, that we support globally. With about 4,000 customers running in our multi-tenant platforms in several AWS regions.
Okay, great. So you've been around, you've been at a few different companies to see some of the ebbs and flows and the trends that have come and went in the ERP and digital transformation space. So it'd be a great conversation here today to dive into a bit. Before we jump into some of these questions I have around sort of the whole concept or the trade-off or decision between ERP systems, best of breed, and hybrid approaches, maybe just tell us a little bit about Infor Software for those that aren't aware of who Infor is or what product suites you own. Maybe just talk a little bit about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem at all. So Infor's thesis behind starting Infor was that ERP platforms in the 90s were built to be generic. So you build one platform. It's a great idea in theory. So you can build an ERP system that solves the problem for any and all industries on the planet, and that worked okay. But it usually is there's a lot of heavy lifting because a company that processes tomatoes makes soup, and another company that builds aircrafts, and an organization that is in public sector, they're all very, very different. So Infor's thesis is that we want to pick the industries where we have expertise. We're not serving every industry on the planet, but then build platforms that are only for adjacent industries. As we go through this conversation, we can talk more about that. But so there's similarity between certain industries that we build on a purpose-built platform, so we can go deeper and solve what I would call last mile capability that requires less customizations, less time to implement. That's the thesis behind Infor. So we serve, I would say broadly speaking, process manufacturing, which is food and beverage, fashion, distribution, chemicals, those industries, and then discrete manufacturing with automotive, aerospace and defense, high-tech industrial manufacturing, and then we also serve healthcare and public sector. Those are the industries we serve, where we feel like we have expertise and we have solutions that can go deeper.
Right.
And everything is deployed in the cloud. So we made a bet that rather than being all things when it comes to technology, we are really good at building, or at least decent at building, these capabilities for these industries. But we partnered with the AWS. So we exclusively run on AWS around the globe in various regions where our platforms are deployed. They are multi-tenant, single instance, where every customer in that industry runs this one instance in the cloud.
Right. Great. Yeah, Infor is one of those software companies in the space that not everyone has heard of, but you're a lot bigger than a lot of people realize in terms of market share as well as revenue, all that stuff. So, a lot of different products that you guys support in a lot of these really targeted industries. And you mentioned something that really sort of segues into the meat of the discussion we want to have here today, which is, I think you made the comment that it sounds good in theory to have a single ERP system, one big massive system that can do everything. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of that model that you and I have both seen evolve, over the last 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, there are clearly advantages to either of those approaches, right? So, and disadvantages. So if you look at a single platform serving every company every organization on the planet, the advantage is that you have one piece of software. The software provider has to maintain only one application stack. that provides economies of scale to a certain extent. And typically, ERPs, at least in my history with working with in this industry, I found that what is core to the platform? Is it financials or is it real operations, right? So a lot of the thinking in the earlier days was much more about financials, very strong capability that has less industry specificity. And I wouldn't say no industry specificity, but less so. And as you move away from that into operations like manufacturing or warehouse management and things like that, where industry specificity does matter in terms of how you run your business. So the advantage of going to industry specific platforms is that it's not just about running financials, but it's also about running your operations. So typically you end up with a lot of bolt-ons in the horizontal use case to try to keep your business running. Your mission critical applications that really support are not financials, it's really the operational system. So our focus, and I would say, and not forget about Infor, but in general though, if you look at how applications get deployed to run mission critical processes, you need last mile capability, right? So I can give you many examples of that, where if you're buying from milk from a farmer, if you're running an ice cream plant, you pay the farmer based on butterfat content, not by gallons or liters of milk, right? So that's a very different process than in a discrete manufacturing scenario or aerospace and defense, where there is strict regulation in terms of how you manage your inventory, and it's more like one of our customers who makes jets has like 2.3 million parts, right, which is very different than processing milk. So
Right.
that's the advantage. The advantage is that you can go last mile, but it does have more cost for the provider. So you got to be willing to spend the resources, money to build it out to have that last mile capability. And I feel like in the cloud, if you're really running multi-tenant single instance, last mile does matter, because there is a level to which you can customize. Customization is the wrong word to use in a multi-tenant cloud, right? You have
Right.
Salesforce, they've done that in CRM, but trying to do that for the ERP space is a little harder.
Mm. Yeah, just the breadth of functionality that's required to, to serve all these different industries and these different functions is very difficult, if not impossible, to do effectively in one system and one platform. And it seems like that's sort of the strategy that, I don't want to say Infor is countering that approach, but you're sort of filling in the void that's left with the impossibility of a single ERP system being everything to everyone. You're trying not to be everything to everyone, but to provide applications that provide that last mile capabilities for specific industries. And you mentioned Salesforce. Salesforce is a great case study of a company that took the vulnerabilities of the single ERP software model, and they exploited that to create a solution that was better, that went deeper and more specialized in one area. And now, of course, over time, they've become more than just a CRM provider, but that's how they started and how they came to get so much market share. And I think Infor has a similar approach too. Would you agree with that, or am I misstating anything there?
Yeah, I do. I agree with that. So we pick industries where we have strength. We can continue to expand as time goes on, but do what we do few things, but do them well, right? So
Right.
when you really think about building the capability into the solution, like I said, the processing of milk and paying the farmer on butterfat content, that's functionality that you need. Either you have it in the solution or you don't.
Right.
In building that out while you're building it out for another industry, which is completely opposite. If you build that on the same platform, yeah, it creates either complexity, or to a certain extent makes it impossible to really manage your roadmap.
Right. Right. Now, what about if I'm a sales rep? I'm going to put myself in a sales rep shoes. I'm a sales rep for vendor A that just so happens to be a single ERP system provider. So in other words, I'm providing, SAP or Oracle or Microsoft, one of those systems that tries to be everything to everyone. My rebuttal, or my way of playing devil's advocate to what you said about some of the weaknesses of the big ERP model, of not being able to be everything to everyone and not being able to provide all the capabilities for specific industries, one thing that I hear often is sales reps who say, well, you just refuse to change. If you would just be open to change and just take our best practices off the shelf, out of the box, then you would be able to use our software, our one single system versus, that best of breed approach. What do you say to that, or what are your thoughts on that, that thought process?
Yeah, I think there is some truth to that. I mean, that is even true for Infor's approach to a certain extent, right? You want to come with a point of view in terms of business processes, but at least my opinion is that there is, I can't put a pinpoint on a percentage, but let's say 15% of your processes are your secret sauce in terms of how you differentiate yourself in your market. And that 15%, you do want to do something that is specific to your industry, specific to your micro vertical. It's not about just food and beverage. It's dairy versus a meat processing plant. There are nuances how you manage that, right? So it is those things that become a little bit of a barrier if you have a horizontal solution. um, you know, running accounts payable or accounts receivable or general ledger and managing financials. It's easier. I do agree with that rep's point of view in terms of you take my point of view and go ahead and implement that. But I think it's harder to do that in the operational side. So at least our belief is, I mean, the audience is the judge, customers are the judge. So I would say that the more you have in the solution to really run your operations that differentiate yourself in the market, that it doesn't require heavy lifting in terms of customization that you have to maintain. My analogy is like a boat anchor. Like if you change a lot from what is being delivered out of the box and you go completely off the reservation, it becomes very difficult to manage over time, right? Digital transformation, which is the topic we're discussing, requires agility, requires flexibility, requires an open architecture. If you don't have that, it becomes very difficult over time.
Right, right. Yeah. And I'm going to come back to that point you just mentioned about agility and architecture here in just a second. But before I do, I just want to turn to the audience here for a moment. And I apologize too, by the way, I'm having a technical issue and I cannot see the all the different chat streams on our streaming platform as I normally would. So you're going to see me looking away on different devices and stuff because I have to manually look at the different feeds here. So I apologize for that. But I just want to give shout outs to some people here who have indicated where they're from today. Thank you, Ryan from Denver, for joining, Peter from London, Vimal from Liverpool, UK, Mitch from Columbia, South Carolina, Kyrgyzstan. We have someone joining in the evening from Kyrgyzstan, someone from Reed, Germany, Steve from Reed, Germany, Limerick, Ireland, Scotland, people all over the world, Julio from Italy. So a lot of different people joining here today. Thank you for joining and letting us know where you're from. I would love to hear too from the audience as we're getting going here, just based on what we've talked about so far. Just drop in the chat. Let me know which model do you think resonates the most with you and what you think is, we'll call it the best, even though there may not be one single answer for universal purposes, but just for argumentative sakes, just drop in the chat. Which do you think is best, the single ERP model, the best of breed, or is it some kind of mix of both? And I'm going to come back to the mix of both here in a moment. So just drop that in the chat if you don't mind. I'd love to see what the audience thinks so far and maybe see if that opinion evolves as we get into the conversation here. But you talked about, right before I turned to the audience here, Soma, you talked about architecture in relation to some of these different models. How does architecture and integration, how does that play into the best of breed model? Maybe help us understand how that, what that means and what is the complexity and cost of maintaining a hybrid or a best of breed model versus that single ERP model. Maybe just help us unpack that a little bit if you don't mind.
Yeah. I would start with this, that even if you have the horizontal ERP as the solution that you use, there's nothing wrong with that. If you do that, I would venture to say that any given organization, highly unlikely that you have this one ERP and that runs everything you need to do in your organization, right? So there is an ecosystem, depending on how complex it depends. But most organizations, if not all, they have an ERP solution, whether it's best of breed, industry specific ERP or horizontal, and then they have other systems in place. So in order for the ecosystem to really function, you need to really have, in my view, two key ingredients. One is, what is the data strategy? And two is, what is your integration or interoperability, API and integration strategy, right? So those two things create sort of, flexibility and agility in your ecosystem that allows for different things to move at different pace. You may not upgrade your ERP if you're running it on-prem or a customized version of it. You highly unlikely you would touch that every 6 months or every year, whereas other systems may move faster. So having a common data architecture and an open architecture is I feel is important no matter what the strategy is. In case of a best of breed ERP, you have the ERP that is, the idea is to have less customization, but then you need to be able to plug that into other applications, some of which could be industry, standard applications, right? Asset management, there's software that you deploy for that. Travel and expense, like you may be running Concur, or you may run Salesforce for CRM. So in that scenario, you definitely want to have a way to really create that flexibility by having a data strategy that allows you to embrace the data across this ecosystem, not just the ERP, right? So having an ERP database in the traditional way, if you have analytical store and the rows, transaction store in the same place, you're in luck if all of your data is in that ERP. But if it is not, which is most likely the case, you need to have a data strategy. How are you going to do deploy insights to your organization? How are you going to deploy things like AI ML to automate your business process? Or if you have RPA, all of these tools require access to data, access to APIs to really influence it.
Right.
So that's what I would call an open architecture, and that's something that any organization, it doesn't have to be Infor user, but you just need to think about that, so that over time you create that very flexible architecture. As your business transforms itself over time, it doesn't necessitate you to go back and change your ERP or upgrade your ERP, which is it's a lot of work. That's sort of what I think is fundamental to deploying, whether you're deploying horizontal or best of breed.
Right. Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, which is that architecture and the data architecture piece that you just described. I asked that in the context of the best of breed model, but you made a really good point, which is even if you're using a vertical a horizontal single integrated quote unquote, and I'll use quotes around the word integrated. It's a single integrated ERP system. A lot of times it's not really that different than the best of breed model. And you mentioned Concur as an example, which leads me to SAP. Let's just pick on SAP for a minute. If you look at SAP S/4HANA, they sort of position and market that solution as a single unified system. But in reality, first of all, that product is very complex. There's a lot of different modules that you have to integrate, and you still have to worry about architecture and all the things you just described, even though it's a single ERP system. But then you add to the fact that they've also acquired these different providers like Ariba, Concur, as you mentioned, success factors on the HR and HCM side. SAP even has become somewhat of a best of breed, or at least a hybrid sort of vendor. So I think everything you're describing is important, even if you aren't pursuing that best of breed model. Even if you're pursuing the single, horizontal ERP system, you still have to have that. I mean, would you agree with that need for architecture and data integration and APIs and all the stuff you just described?
100%. I can sort of use an industry example, which probably will resonate with everyone. We all go to doctors, and sometimes we have to go to a hospital, or if you think about a nurse, we serve that that vertical.
Right.
If you're a nurse, what is important to them, right? Like, so is it the ERP where your human capital, like SuccessFactors equivalent, like our Workday or Infor? You have your record where you can go look at your paycheck and things like that. But you have other systems where I'm managing the nurse's schedule for the day, looking at the condition of the patient, how many hours should they be working with this patient. that's operational for that nurse, right? So
Right.
no matter what, I mean, the really, if you look at the persona on the other side, they don't really think of it as like an ERP. They think of it's like what's the process I need to be part of, and the tools I need to use to be efficient in what I do. Bringing that together is what I'm saying. Like it requires proper thought in terms of bringing the data together so you can make better decisions. Like for example, we pull clinical data, so we know the condition of a patient. If two people come in with pneumonia, but one has dementia, you better make sure that the nurse has more time to spend with the patient with dementia, right? Like so, is
Right.
that's what I mean by interoperability. So bringing the systems together, data together to make better decisions drives the efficiency of the organization.
Right. Yeah, that's well said and well put. And I think that's it's one of those work streams too. When you talk about data architecture, integration, everything you just described, you think about what causes a project to get delayed or what's on the critical path of a transformation or an ERP implementation. And oftentimes it's that. It's the everything you just described, the integration, the building the APIs, the data migration and mapping and all that stuff. I mean, all that stuff can, heavily influence the time and effort it takes to go through a transformation for sure. Um, what about, I want to turn to the audience here. And again, I apologize. This is going to be a bit clumsy because I'm looking at multiple devices here as we talk, and I'm looking away from you, Soma, and I apologize for that. But I'm trying to find some of the good questions here we're getting on the different streams. But here's a question from YouTube, which is a good question here, which is how might an ERP platform be tailored for one industry versus another? What would be different about it? And you mentioned something in passing. You talked about I think it was an aerospace company that had 1.2 million parts. You sort of talked about that, but maybe give us a couple examples in addition to that of specific, industry needs that can't necessarily be tailored by a horizontal ERP system, and maybe describe what some of those last mile capabilities might be. Just a couple examples, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I will just build on the examples that I already started using, right? So in the if you're in the food and beverage side, dairy or bakery or breweries, you are buying your ingredients that are part of your bill of material are supplied largely influenced largely by Mother Nature, right? So you have to rely on the fact that you buy tomatoes to make soup. Not every season every tomato comes in the same shape, same moisture. It doesn't work like that, right? So you have the complexity of what I would call formulations, right? So everyone's familiar with Coca-Cola. Like there's a secret sauce, no pun intended, behind what goes into it, right? So, but it's always consistent. You get a can of Campbell's soup, no matter where you pick it up in the United States, it tastes exactly the same. How do they do that, right? So it has functionality behind it. When the truck arrives with tomatoes, the supplier might have shipped it, weighing at the weigh station at their side, and they think there's 39,500 pounds of tomatoes. You receive it on the other side, there is calibration difference, and you get 39,000. Are you going to dispute that 500? That type of process is very nuanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's built into the, so if it is built into the solution, that you set tolerances, you just run your processes much smoother, right? And the formulation that goes into it is very nuanced. The nutritional label or the label claims you do, reduce sodium or whatever, that's very specific to them. Let me contrast to the aircraft manufacturer, right? We have a customer who uh, builds jets, supplies to Saudi Air Force, Royal Air Force in UK, and so on. You generally run these programs run for years, right? So if you have an F-35 program, that's a 20-year program. You're building fleet, and that you generally get paid based on milestones that you reach, not based on actual delivery, right? So there is a lot of regulation in terms of how you can interchange parts from one fleet to the other fleet. There's a lot of details there, not enough time here to go through that, but you could see in the one side, you build up a plane with 2 million plus parts, you can disassemble them. Once you make the soup, you can't go backwards, right? Like it's a very different process, right?
Right.
So having that in your process. Well, I can tell you, I've worked with one of the largest, grocery retailer in the U.S. Right? They have bakeries all over U.S. One of them happens to be in Denver, your hometown.
Right.
Because it's a mile high, the formulation needs to be different. The yeast content needs to be different,
Hmm.
right? So does your ERP system support that kind of variations, so that you don't need to go and customize the solution, right? So that's what I mean by building solutions that are purpose built. Um, I don't want to build an ERP just for dairy. That's not economical. But you can build one for food and beverage, fashion. Let's say what's common between chemicals, fashion, and food and beverage. There's something common. They all measure their SKUs with their attributes,
Hmm.
right? Size, fit, color in fashion, potency in chemical, or butterfat content in milk. You could see some connection there. Like, so you can build something that is has cross industry adjacent innovation, but it doesn't have the bloat of something like an aerospace and defense, which got nothing to do with a bakery.
Right. That's a great example. I mean, it's you're also touching on a whole unit of measure um, complexity and nuance that a lot of times ERP systems struggle with, which is, you talked about Coca-Cola, for example. You buy one can, but one can equals 16 ounces. And so you have two different units of measure you have to track. You have to track the one can, but you also have to track the 16 ounces. And that's creates a lot of complexity, and it wreaks havoc on a lot of vertical ERP systems. But to your point, it's an example of how an industry specific need that is an absolutely a requirement. You can't just brush that off and say, well, we just won't use the whole unit of measure conversion thing. We'll find a way around that. I don't think you're going to find a way around that to run your business effectively. So I think that it's a great point. Um, there's a question I want to get to that sort of leads into maybe a thread, a middle ground I want to get to here. I've been asking you a lot of questions so far in sort of a very binary, either or, black and white sort of mentality of, do I want a vertical single ERP system or a horizontal single ERP system, or do I want a best of breed model? But there's some sort of a hybrid here that we can touch on too. And this is from Brian on LinkedIn. Brian says a composable approach that makes best use of standard ERP functionality with industry-specific best-of-breed and custom-tailored applications where they provide distinct competitive advantage. So he's sort of leading us into this discussion around a hybrid model where you take what you can and you use that sort of that horizontal single ERP software, that core back office ERP software, but then you use industry-specific applications where appropriate to give you that competitive advantage or to address those industry specific needs. Maybe talk a little bit about this hybrid model. What is a hybrid model, or what is that middle ground that we could be looking at? It's not, so in other words, it's not either or. It's not just single ERP or best of breed. It's sort of that middle ground. Maybe describe that for us. Help us understand what that might look like.
Yeah. This goes back to what I was saying, that even if you run a horizontal ERP, most companies have more than just that one application, right? So why did they do that? Because they have a need to go beyond, whether it could be a horizontal business process requirement like CRM, or it could be something so specific in their manufacturing that they need something that as a bolt-on, right? So while the industries represented in this audience is quite varied, right? So we can't answer in detail on every one of them, but what is common is that you need an open architecture. You need a data strategy that actually thinks about the fact that you have a hybrid approach, whether you like it or not. The hybrid approach has two aspects to it. One, multiple applications connected together to support your business process. That's a hybrid deployment. Also, some applications may be running in the cloud, some applications may be running on premise. That's another view on hybrid, right? So Salesforce, you have no choice. It's only running in the cloud, period, right?
Mm-hmm.
So are you running Infor's HCM or someone else's HCM? It's only running in the cloud, right? So,
Right.
but then you have other choices. So to me, the hybrid approach is a reality. It is something that we don't think about, but most companies do have that in their ecosystem. So once you are in that, if you have an open architecture that is in place, you have choices you can make. You're not cornered into selecting an application that is not really fit for purpose, and you tailor that for yourself, versus buying something that is tailored, subscribing to a service that really is tailored, but then it doesn't make you do a lot of heavy lifting to connect it into your ecosystem. So I do think that hybrid, in either it's cloud and on-prem or multiple applications in your ecosystem, is a reality. I would like to hear if the audience thinks differently, because there's always something to learn. But what I know, this is what I've seen.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a comment, and I'll be curious as well, by the way, to see what the audience thinks and which of these models is resonating the most with you so far in our discussion. Is it the single ERP model, the best of breed, or sort of the hybrid? Just I'd love to see in the chat what you think is the best model here. But here's a question I want to get to that actually I don't know how to answer this question or respond to it. So I want to see if maybe you do, Soma. It's kind of a tough one. This is from Israel on YouTube. Israel says, "Hi guys, I think you're missing out on a very important thing. At the end of the day, the vendor wants to sell, and he will be whatever the customer needs. That's why the vendor will be everything he or she can sell." So in other words, it sounds like what Israel is saying is that naturally vendors are going to provide whatever capabilities the software needs as long as they can sell it. Would you agree with that? Or do you think that any vendor could provide anything that a customer might need, even these last mile capabilities that you're talking about, or what's your knee-jerk reaction to that?
My knee-jerk reaction is, sales aside, what is the reality? Really, this is a dumb example, right? So I have a general practitioner, a family doctor that I go to, right?
Right.
Generally, that's all I need. But if I have a condition, I have a heart disease, I don't think the general practitioner is going to be able to help me much. I need to go to a cardiologist. So so if you just use that as this is a very dumb example, but specialty does matter, right? So when something is so specific, it solves your problem better than somebody else, it does help, right? When you need that, you need that. Like I mentioned, nurse scheduling in the healthcare. Yeah,
Right.
that is something that's going to benefit, because nurses are burnt out, especially after COVID. They just don't want to be in that profession. Like, you want to make sure that you retain nurses, you allocate that sufficient time for them. Don't make them walk back and forth. A nurse in a shift walks 9 miles, at least in the US. That's kind of, a study has shown that. That's 9 miles of walking that's really healthy for the nurse, but it's a waste of time, right? So
Yeah.
they should be spending more time with the patient. That's what the nuance is that I'm talking about, right? So that I don't believe that anyone can deliver that. You had to be specialized to be able to deliver that.
Right. You might be able to sell it. It doesn't mean it's the right fit. It doesn't mean it's a good idea. But I guess back to Israel's point, software vendors that compete with that scenario, and even if they don't have strong capabilities in that area of nurse scheduling in that example, you're probably still going to try and sell some half solution that might be able to sort of address those needs, but it doesn't mean it's the right fit.
No, exactly. Yeah. I
Great
mean,
point.
obviously the seller is motivated to sell whatever they can, right? So that's what they're paid to do. But it's as a buyer on the other side, we want to make sure that we really get the capabilities we need.
Right. Absolutely. But here's a comment from Julio on LinkedIn. Julio says, "I agree. In my personal opinion, the difference is being done by how you can tailor make the software based on the customer needs." So I think Julio is sort of leaning towards this either hybrid or best of breed model to provide those last mile capabilities. Here's a question, an interesting question from Ryan on LinkedIn. Ryan says, "It seems with the emergence of AI platforms that there's a best of breed approach to linking software platforms together to leverage each platform's best-in-class AI software. How does AI or machine learning impact your thinking as it pertains to the future of larger ERP systems? Do you see the ERP vendors creating their own AI features or plugging in third-party AI systems?" So it's hard to have a conversation these days without talking about AI or ChatGPT. So let's talk about AI for a minute. What do you think to Ryan's question there?
No, that's a great question. So it, we I wouldn't say that, I will use an Infor example. I'm not trying to just say that Infor's approach is the best approach or not, but that's for you to judge. But if you really think about, in industry specificity, and we have more than one platform, clearly, right? So more than one ERP to go to market. It created an economic disadvantage for us. So how do we do this in a smart way? So we built this architecture, what I would call in an event-driven architecture, where when things happen in the application, it pushes in a verbose fashion data out to a data lake, right?
Mm,
So you have all this data coming from various applications into one place, and you build these things like you may deploy the capability through a mobile app, which may be completely tailor-made by the customer, but you still want to have an API strategy that can get back to the service you need, so you don't have to write a whole lot of customization, right? So if you take those two things that I keep harping on, then now if you look at AI, the AI capabilities in a typical organization, at least what I've seen, is that you're either trying to automate a business process that human beings don't have to be part of, something that's mundane,
right.
or you are optimizing, could be inventory optimization, or in aerospace and defense bid optimization, you're optimizing things. Or if those two things don't happen in that order, you're at least providing insight to a user to make a better decision. Like you go to Amazon, you buy something, it tells you people who bought this other thing as well. That's more a recommendation that it drives your behavior, right? So
Right.
if those three things, I feel, influence the business process. So what we did is essentially we're both deployed on AWS, like I said. So we use SageMaker, which is their AI platform. We built our IP on top of that. We have a data lake. So the AI platform really leverages the data that is in the data lake, that is not just ERP data, across your ecosystem. You solve whatever problem you're trying to solve, you want to be able to influence the business process. So by using the API, you go and either automate or optimize or provide insight in the user experience, right? So in a sense, every AI platform has its own capabilities, right? So you can have, a Watson that solves, somebody's medical issue, right? So that's a different kind of problem, versus in a typical business, you're trying to do what I just described, right? So AI has a lot to play with this, and ChatGPT is more of a conversational side of it, right? So as time goes on, that's going to have influence as well. Instead of the typical user experience, it may be completely different kind of user experience, how they
Right.
consume it, which brings me back to an API strategy and data strategy, right?
Hmm.
If you have that right, and a security strategy clearly, then it anything that happens as time goes on doesn't create a huge barrier for adoption.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing we haven't touched on yet, we've sort of danced around it or come up on this, but we haven't really delved into it, is this. We've talked about best of breed, we've talked about horizontal integrated ERP systems, we've talked about a hybrid model. What about software platforms? What is a software platform? And feel free to use Infor as an example, because I know you guys sort of prescribe to this model and have used it to as part of your product strategy. But maybe talk about what is a platform and how is that different than what we're talking about here so far?
Yeah, I mean, platform is a word that sort of people use it in a loose fashion. But if you have a monolithic application that's got a lot of configuration setting, you can have 90,000 dials to tweak to do what you need to do. But at the end of the day, it's kind of monolithic. It does what it does, and you can sort of turn off things and turn on things to get what you need.
Mm-hmm.
A platform, um, in my opinion, allows for an ecosystem to work well, right? Not just this one application that we are talking about, right? So the info, right, our idea, right? Again, you're the judge. So we have AWS services at the bottom, right? So you have Amazon S3, which we are using for our data lake. But we don't want to expose directly the AWS services directly to the user. So we have this layer called Infor, open architecture, open service, so which sits on top of that, which has the integration layer, the API layer, the data lake layer, security, and so on, right? Unstructured data and all that. So you have a layer on top of that, and then you have the app on top of that, right? So you have specific apps. So in your best of breed example, you could have a PLM system, you could have a CRM system that sits on top of that. And if you have that layered approach, and you have a user experience on top, which is a portal architecture, where you want to, at the end of the day, just using SAP example, if I have Concur and I have Ariba and I have success factors, I have S4 HANA, for the end user who's in a particular role, they shouldn't have to worry about which application I'm going to, right? So I just get the service I need. I want to get my job done and do my day job versus sitting with the system and spending more time with it, right? So if you look at it at that layers, creating a platform architecture that allows for these apps to sit in the right layer, I feel will give us all, I mean, whether I'm a software vendor or an end user company, it gives me a lot more opportunity to morph it into what I need in my organization versus being handcuffed.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that's a great summary of what a platform is. And I think it's a way for us all as organizations to fight that battle or find that right balance between I want standardization and I want commonality in my platforms. I don't want a spaghetti bowl diagram of 100 different applications. That's what I had before. I'm trying to move away from that. So, we would all love for that pendulum to swing all the way to the other extreme where we find that silver bullet magic horizontal ERP system that's fully integrated, gives us everything we want. But I think what we're saying here is, in many cases, if not most cases, that's just not realistic. So we're trying to fight that battle between commonality, single system, but we're also trying to retain flexibility and agility. And those are two conflicting priorities. And I think what you're describing here with software platform strategy, which is really looking at your platform and the ecosystem of applications you're using, you can have some commonality there that allows you to sort of have the best of both worlds in some ways. You've got some standardization, you've got some integration, you have some commonality and integration between systems, but you also have flexibility. You're not, to your point, you're not locked in or backed into a corner on what the limitations of just one application might be. And I'm curious too, back in the 90s, you look back to when you and I were really kind of coming up in the industry, or in my case, I was starting out in the 90s, and even in the early 2000s, you would talk about best of breed, and it sort of had a negative connotation. It's sort of like, yeah, best of breed, that's just, no single source of truth. It's too complex. And I think a lot of that negative perception has carried through into the 2020s especially for people that have been in the industry for a long time. But I think, what I'm seeing is that you mentioned interoperability, you mentioned software platforms, as we're talking about here now. You have all these different options that you didn't really have, that weren't really as viable of options as they were 10 or 20 years ago. Do you see that continuing in that direction, or what do you think the future is here with sort of these different paths we're talking about? Do they all coexist peacefully and there's just going to be different options for different people? Or do you think one of these schools of thought might sort of dominate here later in the 2020s into the 2030s?
Yeah, I don't have the crystal ball, but but certainly you make a very good point. Sometimes ideas are way ahead of time, and we don't have the right technology. I remember, Sun Microsystems, the CEO announcing something called Genie, which will be basically your refrigerator will know exactly when you need milk and this, things like that, right? So technology wasn't there. Cloud wasn't there. Cloud was only associated with weather at that time, right? So it's a very different world we are living in now. I do have a refrigerator. I can go to the grocery store. I can turn on the camera in my fridge to see what I have. Do I really have tomatoes or not? Right. So the technologies sometimes require time to mature. So I do think that the best of breed idea, when in the early in the 80s and 90s, it was best of breed. Then it became, let's go to single, because the technologies were too complex. And I
Right.
think it's now becoming more ubiquitous that you can use that. But I'll also tell you, I don't think there is any company that is not thinking about either getting bought or they're buying somebody, right? So
Mhm.
industries are always consolidating. And as soon as you acquire a company, guess what? You now have 2 ERP platforms. So
good point.
whether you like it or not, you have to now integrate. The first thing you do is not to replace the ERP. The first thing you do is to integrate the business, get visibility into data, which is why I go back to what I said. Even in a scenario where horizontal ERP may be fine for an organization, maybe the best thing to do, but you still need a data strategy and an API strategy because industries do consolidate.
Yeah, it's a great point. And oftentimes when you're a private equity backed company, let's just say, and you've gone out and acquired another company with a different system, oftentimes the last thing the PE firm wants you to do is go through a massive rip and replace of the systems across the company or the companies. And so this interoperability, the integration, all the stuff you're talking about here is a good sort of lower risk sort of option that allows you to, again, get some of that low hanging fruit, get some business value without necessarily taking on the cost or risk of a massive ERP replacement.
Exactly.
Yeah, great point. There's a lot of really good questions coming in, so I'm trying to cherry pick a couple here. Since we're on the thread of integration, I'll take this question here from Brian on LinkedIn, who says, building on your last comments, do you think that the integration technologies available today are mature enough to enable the hybrid approach? And is it possible to harmonize and interoperate the data model across applications?
Yeah, another great question. So I can only speak from my own experience. So I apologize if I use Infor examples. So what we had the same challenge, right? So what we did was basically we took the Open Application Group standards. So we took their canonical model as the way to describe data. So we took it. We didn't. We built our own IP on top of it because not everything was really useful for us. But the fundamentals of having a canonical model, if you say location, what does that mean, right? If you have a one way to define a customer, and even if you have duplicates, customer codes, you can start to build deduping. Customer A and customer B actually are really the same customer. You can build fuzzy logic. So we built all our the data models outside of the ERP and other these best of breed applications we're talking about, independent of them, create an industry data model that supports the fact that you could be running whatever applications you're running, but at the end of the day, if you can get me the data that I need, you have an industry data model that I can use for my own innovation. When I say my own, I'm talking from the audience side, right? You can build your innovation, but you're not directly touching the ERP, right? So you have the data externalized and you build your own industry data model. So using, it doesn't have to be Open Application Group. We found that to be useful for us. But having a common data model that allows for that innovation to happen outside of your core applications is definitely a good way to build a resilient architecture.
Right. Now, what about I actually got some messages on LinkedIn and even to my email when we announced that you were going to be on this live stream, and a couple people pinged me and said, "Hey, can you ask Soma some questions around Infor's product strategy?" And I think it might be helpful to not only understand Infor's product suite and what the different applications are, but also in the context of how are you're using different applications to tailor your solutions for different markets. So could you give us sort of a high level 20,000 foot overview of the Infor product suite and how you're creating these sort of hybrid solutions for different industries?
Yeah. Don't want it to be a commercial on Infor, but this is what we did, right? So basically, as I mentioned during the course of this last hour, we picked few industries where we feel we have industry expertise in our solution and we have people with expertise. So we chose healthcare as a key focus area for us because mostly in North America, not outside of North America, and then manufacturing split into discrete and process manufacturing. So we have 3 platforms that really support these 3 different verticals, right? So one supports, there is no order management in healthcare, whereas in manufacturing you do, right? So So we built 3 platforms. We built this common platform that I mentioned called Infor OS, which is, call it the digital backbone on which everything is built. So it supports a common single gateway API strategy. It has an event-driven, this OAGS canonical model, right? It supports data being published in a event-driven fashion near real time into a data lake. It supports unstructured data like a scanned invoice, for example, and on and on. So we built these common services in one place. Functional components that are common, like budgeting and planning, can be common, right? So like an Oracle EPM kind of solution. So we picked the best of breed capabilities that can span horizontally across applications. So you have 3 ERP platforms that support these industries that go deeper in functionality. You have common engineering services that supports a digital backbone, which sits on top of AWS. And we have these best of breed edge apps, like the SAP example, right? So if you were to have a single user experience for Concur and Ariba and SuccessFactors and deployed based on a persona who's using the system. We're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but our idea was, if you buy something from Infor and deploy it, subscribe to a service in the cloud, you should have a single user experience. You should have a point of view in terms of an integration. Won't be perfect, but at least it's a point of view. Like, here's how these things work together.
Right.
So we essentially support 7 key focus industries, which I already mentioned. One is inside discrete, it's aerospace and defense, automotive, both specialty OEMs as well as suppliers, tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, industrial manufacturing, and then you have fashion, food and beverage, distribution, and then healthcare, and secondarily in public sector. Those are the industries we serve primarily. And we basically continue to invest in these 3 platforms to go deeper and deeper to support capabilities that require less and less customization.
Right. You made a good comment right there in passing, but also when you and I were prepping for this conversation last week, you made a comment that I hadn't really thought of in this context, but you mentioned the word capability, and you talked about how Infor has acquired different software providers over the years, not only to get the IP, the technology IP itself and being able to build those capabilities from a technical perspective, but also you're acquiring industry specific capabilities and just sort of general organizational knowledge of industries. And I thought that was just a really interesting perspective. I mean, it sounds like common sense when you say it, but I hadn't really thought of it in that context. And I thought that was a really good point, that when you think about the capabilities of a software provider or vendor that you might be considering, it's not just what the software can do, but it's also organizationally, how that organization or that vendor supports a certain industry or a certain function or whatever the case may be. I think that's a really important consideration as you're evaluating vendors. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. Yeah.
So I guess just to bring this all full circle and to sort of put a ribbon on this whole conversation, we've talked about a lot of different models here. We've talked about the ERP, the single ERP model, the best of breed, the hybrid model, the software platform model. If I'm a organization that's about to start a digital transformation, I'm trying to figure out what my options are and what's the best option for me. What are some high level recommendations you would give to organizations to help them determine which strategy or strategies are going to make the most sense for them as an organization?
Yeah, just to kind of summarize, I think it's not that you go out immediately look for applications that you can deploy in your ecosystem. First, kind of look in the mirror in terms of what capabilities you need for your organization's business transformation or digital transformation, your acquisition strategy over the years, and the secret sauce that you have to differentiate yourself in the business, and then work from there to really look at a blueprint of what kind of capabilities you need to really support that transformation for your organization. And then you start to fill the puzzle in terms of what really makes sense, whether it's a horizontal ERP capability that solves that problem for you, or a best of breed, in some cases the combination of the two, Do you really embrace a cloud strategy, or do you really want to control your data and everything in your data center? These are all decisions you make before you start to look at how do I assemble these capabilities together, right? So it's an exercise that every company should do, and have a blueprint that can sustain itself for the next, let's say, at least 5 to 10 years, if not beyond
Right.
that. And then I think what you do, decision making becomes easier. It creates a sustainable plan from a digital ecosystem.
Right. Yeah, that's well said. It's almost like you need to look in the mirror, look at who you are today, and then look to the future and look at what you're trying to become in the future, and which of these paths is going to best align with that. And I think the other thing too is to recognize that there aren't any silver bullets too. I think, we're all looking for that silver bullet, that easy answer, that thing that mitigates all the risk, that just takes away all these trade-offs and risks. And that, I guess the reality here is that there's just going to be trade-offs. There's going to be risks, and there's going to be, one model, for example, the hybrid model might solve the flexibility challenge by providing a more flexible option, but it's creating perhaps a little bit more technical complexity, in that now you need to integrate multiple systems. So I think a lot of times, though, we forget that that there's actually upsides and downsides to any of these paths, and I think it's just a matter of looking at which of these paths best aligns with where you are today and where you're headed in the future. And that answer oftentimes is different for different organizations. So just well said on your point there about how to determine that best strategy and to look in the mirror as a starting point to get there. Well, great. Well, how can people connect with you? If I want to connect with you, learn more about you, or just learn more about Infor, how do I connect with you personally? How do I connect and learn more about Infor? What are some takeaways we could
Yeah.
take here?
I wasn't joking that I'm known by one name. So my
Right.
email is soma@infor.com. You don't need to spell my last name. I'm always happy to sort of learn, because I don't know a whole lot. I know a few things, but I've learned that over the years. So
Right.
if there are things that are mutually beneficial, that ideas that that helps me, and ideas that can help you, always ready to engage. Soma@infor.com.
Great. And of course, Infor.com is where we can learn more about the Infor product suite if we want to learn more about M3 and Sightline and all the different solutions you guys provide and where it fits. So be sure to check that out too if you want to learn more about Infor. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here today. Really appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy. You're despite your humbleness, you actually are a celebrity in the industry. So I really appreciate having you here on the live stream in our podcast here today. So thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for hosting me, and thanks to the audience for listening.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for all the great questions. Apologies, I wasn't able to get to questions as fast as I usually am with the technical glitches here, but we did get to some really good questions here. And again, this interview will become part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast episode that gets released a week from tomorrow, on Wednesday of next week. You can find Transformation Ground Control streaming every Wednesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as new episodes, the audio episodes dropping on audio podcast platforms like Google, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, all those different platforms. You can find Transformation Ground Control on there, which is a weekly podcast I host every week. So thank you, everyone, for joining here today. Thank you again, Soma. Hope everyone has a great week, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.